Now that we're able to fetch and render the blog posts into our application, let's add the ability to create new ones by building a blog post editor component. For that, we need to install a few packages. First, we're going to need a React Markdown. To convert Markdown to JS6, we could actually render in our React application. Then React Syntax Highlighter to highlight code snippets inside the blog posts. And finally, the Tailwind CSS typography plugin to add beautiful typographic defaults to the blog post content render as JS6 from the React Markdown package. Once everything has been installed, go back to your editor and create a new file inside the components folder and name it editor.js. Import useStates from React and then create the editor component with the following props we will use inside that component. Then define a state variable to store the blog post title. Initialize it with the title value from the initial data prop, otherwise use an empty string. Create a second state variable, but this time for the blog post content. Again, use the initial data prop to initialize this variable. And before I forget, export the editor component at the bottom of this file. Now, let's render the JSX for this component. Start by wrapping it inside a div element and add the blog post title section using a text area element. Set the value to the title state variable. Implement the unchanged prop using the setTitle function and pass the new value with e.target.value. Set the max length to 150 characters. Specify a placeholder for the text area. Set the disable prop to the text area from the corresponding prop of the editor component. And finally, add a few Tailwind CSS utility classes to style the text area. After that, let's add a section with all the action the user can perform on the blog post he is editing. We'll start by adding two tabs to switch between the editing view and the blog post preview. So scroll up to the top of your file and create a new variable to define the text and the icon we will use for each of these two tabs. Don't forget to import the icons from heroicons/react/outline. Now, scroll back down to your JSX and in line 38, loop over the tabs array using the map method to render each tab as a button. You can use the text as the key for each tab. Then implement the onClick event by setting the active tab using the current index from the map loop. Then, set the button as disable if specified by the prop from the editor component. Finally, add a few Tailwind CSS utility classes to style the buttons. Style the icon and the button's text as well. Now go back up and create the state variable for keeping track of the active tab. Initialize it with 0. Next, let's add the publish and delete actions after our tabs. Check that the show publish button prop is true to render the button to publish the blog post. Implement the onClick event by calling the onPublish prop with the title and content values. Then set the button as disable if specified by the prop from the editor component and style it as before. Do the same thing with the delete action, except that for this one, we check the show delete button prop instead. And we call the onDelete function onClick. Also change the icon of this button to use the trash icon instead. Then import the icon we haven't imported yet from heroicons. Alright, now let's render the section for the blog post content. In that section, check the active tab. If the active tab is the first one, render a text area and use the content state variable for allowing the user to edit the blog post content. Otherwise, render an article element for the blog post preview. If there is no content, simply display a text message to let the user know that there is nothing to preview. Otherwise, use the React Markdown component to render the blog post content passed to the children prop. This component will parse the blog post content string and convert it to JS6 so we can support Markdown and render the formatted result inside our application. And of course, don't forget to import React Markdown at the top of your file. Before we move on with our blog post editor, we'll create two other components that we will use with React Markdown to format the link and code blocks inside the blog post content. Indeed, React Markdown allows us to specify custom components that are used to render specific tag elements. So let's start with the linked elements. Create a new file named customlink.js and export a React functional component that accepts href and the children props. Then check if the href is an internal link or not by checking if this string starts with a / character. So if it is an internal link, render the link component from next/link, add the href value to it, and add a head tag inside it with the children prop. Otherwise, render a regular head tag by using targets blank and rel no opener no referrer to open the link inside a new browser's tab. Now let's create the custom component for rendering the code blocks defined in the Markdown content. So create a codeblock.js file, import Prism as syntax highlighter from React syntax highlighter, import tomorrow from React syntax highlighter, /gist /cgs/styles/prism. Next, create the codeblock React component and pass node, inline, class name, children, and all the other props to it. Then, export your component as default. Now, extract the programming language of this code block from the class name prop provided by React Markdown by using a regular expression. Next, if this code block is not inline and that we have found the programming language, render the syntax highlighter component. Pass the programming language as a prop to it. Specify the styles using the tomorrow styles from Prism we have imported above. Specify the content of the code block through the children prop by converting the children prop from the argument above to a string and by removing all the new line characters at the end. Then change the pre-tag to a div element. And next, we need to define some custom style to remove the background and the padding of this component we don't need as we are using Tailwind CSS for that. Finally, pass all the remaining props to it. And in case we have an inline code block, just render a code element, specify the class name, and all the remaining props, and pass the children to it. Now, let's wrap our two custom components, the custom link and the code block, inside a single object that we can call MD components. This object is useful to aggregate all our custom components that are used by React Markdown, so that if we have a lot of them, we just need to import MD components to React Markdown, and not all the custom components one by one. So start by importing your custom component at the top. Then create the MD components object with the custom link for the A tag and the code block component for the code tag. Finally, export MD component as default. Alright, now let's go back to your editor component and import MD components at the top. Then pass MD components to the components prop of the React Markdown component. With that, all the links and code blocks in our Markdown will be rendered using the two custom React components we defined earlier. Now let's move on and see what else do we need for our blog post editor component. As you can see, this component is accepting an unchanged prop as a function. This function should be called inside our components every time the title or the blog post content are updated by the user. So let's go ahead and implement that logic. First, import useEffect and useRef from React, as we'll need those hooks to implement the onChange event. Then import useDebounce from useDebounce, which we will use to debounce our state variable so that we don't call the onChange function every time the user is hitting a keystroke. Next, inside the editor component, create a new variable called debounceTitle by using the useDebounce hook. Pass the title state variable and specify the debounce delay from the editor prop. Then, do the same thing with the component state variable. Next, create a variable to check if this is the initial rendering of our component using the useRef hook, which keeps track of a Boolean value between renderings. Now, create a side effect using the useEffect hook and pass the two debounce variable inside the dependencies array so that this effect is triggered only when the values of those variables are changed. If this is the initial rendering of our component, update the initial render reference value to false and return, so that we don't run anything else from that side effect for the initial render. This is necessary because the debounce variable will change when initialized with the state variables during the initial rendering of our component. So our side effect will be triggered in this case, even if the user hasn't changed any value yet, which does not make sense to call the unchanged event at this time. So that's why we keep track of the initial render and return nothing from the side effect in this case. Otherwise, we call the unchanged prop function with our debounce values. Now that we have everything in place, let's use Tailwind CSS to style the blog post content preview. So open your Tailwind CSS config file, and inside the plugin section, import the Tailwind CSS typography plugin. Next, extend the theme section by adding the typography key and pass a function that accepts a theme, argument, and renders an object. We will use that function to define the default style for some elements of our typography section. So define the color of the A tag as colors.blue.600 from the default theme provided by Tailwind CSS, and set the color on hover as well with colors.blue.700. Next, create another key named dark to define the styles for the elements of our typography section when our application is in dark mode. You can define the styles you want. Here I'm just specifying a light gray color for all those elements. Now go back to your editor component file and add onto the article element on line 114 the Tailwind CSS utility classes of the typography plugin we just configured before. So we have prose for the default typography styles, then dark prose dark for the dark mode, and sm::prose lg and lg::prose xl for making everything looks nice on different devices. Then you can also remove the maximum width size, which is specified by the plugin by default.